She crossed half a continent for a man who never showed up. Stood alone on a rotting platform in the middle of Montana wilderness, watching the last train disappear into mountains that didn't care if she lived or died. 23 years old. One suitcase. A bundle of letters from a man who had written about sunrise kitchens and shared futures and love that was worth waiting for. Every person in that tiny town watched her from behind glass windows and curtains. Watched and said nothing. Did nothing. Because out here, a woman abandoned by a promise was simply another cautionary tale. But one man walked toward her instead of away. And that changed everything. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train didn't slow gently. It shrieked to a stop the way something wounded does, all grinding metal and expelled steam. And the sound rolled out across the valley like a warning nobody had bothered to post. Evelyn Harper pressed her face briefly against the window glass as the platform came into view. She was looking for a tall man, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the way she'd pictured him in her mind 100 times during the 3-day journey from Boston. She'd constructed him from his handwriting, from the careful loops of his letters, the measured space between his words, the way he wrote, "I am not a man of poetry" in one sentence, and then proceeded to spend 4 pages describing the way light moved across his land at different hours of the day. She told herself that wasn't poetry. She'd been lying to herself, and she'd known it and done it anyway, because sometimes a woman needs something to hold on to during the dark middle hours of a long night. She gathered her coat, her hat, and the small valise she kept under the seat, and she told herself to breathe. The conductor, a heavy-set man with a tobacco-stained mustache, helped her down the steps without making eye contact. He set her larger trunk on the platform boards with a thud that vibrated up through the soles of her boots. "Redstone Crossing," he announced, though she was the only passenger disembarking. 30-minute stop. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She turned around. The platform was empty. Not quiet. There was a cluster of men near the freight end of the train, loading crates of something onto a flatbed wagon, and a woman in a blue coat was speaking with someone inside the station house. There were people. There simply was not her person. Evelyn stood still and let 30 seconds pass, the way you do when you're giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he'd been delayed. Maybe the road from the ranch was unpredictable. She'd read enough about Montana to know that distance out here was a different animal than distance back east. He'd written that his land was 14 miles from town. 14 miles on a good road in decent weather was manageable. 14 miles on a road that the mountains had been working on all summer might be a different proposition entirely. She picked up her valise and walked to the far end of the platform where she could see the main road cutting north out of town. Nothing coming. Flat gray sky pressing down on everything, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and just making threats. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed had gone fully yellow, and several of them had given up and dropped their leaves entirely, leaving branches that looked like cracks running through the air. She waited. The freight was loaded. The conductor reappeared, calling the boarding signal. Still no one on the road. Evelyn walked back to stand beside her trunk. She put one hand on top of it, not because she was worried about it going anywhere, but because it was the only solid thing available. The train's whistle split the air once, twice. The locomotive shuddered and began to move. She watched it go. The sound of it faded up the valley in stages. The mechanical noise first, then the echo off the rock faces to the north, and then just the wind, which had been there all along but which she could now hear clearly. It moved through the cottonwood branches with a dry, papery sound that was nothing like the wind she'd grown up with back in Massachusetts, where it came off the ocean and smelled like salt and distance. This wind smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and it carried the faint, raw bite of the elevation. Evelyn stood on the platform and looked at Redstone Crossing. Main Street was maybe 300 yards of storefronts, most of them wooden, some of them braced on their uphill sides by timber props where the road's shoulder had eroded. A general store, what looked like a hardware outfit, a building with a hand-lettered sign she couldn't read from this distance. A saloon, which she could identify because it was the building with 2 horses tied out front and the sound of a badly tuned piano coming through its wall. A small building set slightly apart that might have been a post office or a barber or both. Farther down, toward the creek, a cluster of houses, some with smoke coming from their chimneys, some dark. Maybe 200 people, she guessed. Maybe less. She became aware that she was being watched. It wasn't dramatic about it. There was no pointing, no gathering crowd, just the quiet peripheral attention of a small town that notices everything and comments on nothing directly. The woman in the blue coat had stopped speaking and was watching her from inside the station house doorway. One of the freight men had glanced over twice. A boy of maybe 12 was outright staring from the corner of the general store. Evelyn straightened her spine. She picked up her valise, positioned it in her left hand, and walked toward the station house because that was the only logical thing to do. A person needed information before they needed anything else. The station master was a thin man named Earl Potts, who had the kind of face that had made its peace with bad news a long time ago. He looked at her from behind his window without surprise, which itself told her something. "I'm looking for Silas Rowan," Evelyn said. "He was supposed to meet me." "Rowan," Earl repeated. He said the name the way you say something you're choosing to say carefully. "That's right. He ranches east of here, I believe. About 14 miles. Earl Potts looked at her for a moment, then at the window behind her, then back at her. "You the woman from Boston?" Evelyn's stomach did something cold and slow. "Yes." "He didn't—" Earl stopped, started again, differently. "You got a place to stay tonight?" "He was supposed to arrange—" She stopped herself. "No, not yet." Earl nodded once, like something had been confirmed. "You might try the Alderman house. Claire Alderman takes in boarders, down past the hardware store. Blue door." "Is Silas Rowan expected in town today?" A pause that lasted perhaps a second too long. "I couldn't say for certain." Evelyn held his gaze long enough to make clear she understood that he was deciding how much to tell her, and that she was marking the evasion without commenting on it. Then she said, "Thank you," in a voice that was level and quiet, and she turned and walked back to the platform to collect her trunk. The trunk was heavy, heavier than it needed to be. She'd been told that by 3 different people, and she managed to get it standing upright and began working it along the platform boards by tilting and pivoting, one corner at a time. It was slow and undignified, and the wood was rough enough that she'd get splinters through her gloves if she wasn't careful. She focused on the mechanics of it because that was more useful than thinking about what Earl Potts's silence had meant. "That's going to take you most of the evening." She turned. A man had appeared at the edge of the platform, not from the street, but from the direction of a side alley between the station and the building next to it. He was tall, built in the way that outdoor work builds people, wide through the shoulders with no waist anywhere. Maybe 32 or 33. His face was weathered in a way that suggested he'd been working in open country long enough that the weather had left a record of it. He had dark eyes that were assessing the situation in the flat, practical way of someone who was calculating what needed doing rather than deciding whether to get involved. He was already getting involved. He'd asked the question. "I'm managing," Evelyn said. He looked at the trunk, looked at the distance to the street, looked at her. Not with pity. She would have reacted badly to pity, but with what appeared to be an honest evaluation of the logistics. "Clara Alderman's house?" he asked. She stared at him. "How did you know that?" "Earl sends people there." He moved to the trunk without further discussion, got his hands under the handles at each end, and lifted it like it wasn't the object that had been defeating her for the past 3 minutes. "I didn't ask for help," Evelyn said. "No," he agreed, already walking. "You didn't." She stood still for 2 full seconds, long enough to register that she was being either rescued or managed and couldn't determine which, and then she picked up her valise and her reticule and followed him because the alternative was watching her trunk disappear down Main Street with a stranger. "I don't know who you are," she said, catching up. "Gideon Mercer." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was navigating a loose board in the sidewalk. "Evelyn Harper." "I know." She stopped again. "How do you know my name?" This time he did glance at her, briefly, sideways. "Small town. Train only comes twice a week. Word gets around." She walked in silence for a moment, processing that. "What word, specifically?" He didn't answer immediately. He was turning the corner past the hardware store, which had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising axe handles and lamp oil. The blue door Earl had described was visible halfway down the next block, a narrow 2-story structure that looked like it had originally been built as something else and converted. "Mr. Mercer," she said. The word, he said, still without looking at her, was that Silas Rowan had written to a woman in Boston about coming to Redstone Crossing, and that she was arriving on the Wednesday train. And where is Silas Rowan? Another pause. They had reached the blue door. He set the trunk down on the porch boards and straightened, and for the first time she had the full measure of his face turned toward her. It wasn't an unkind face. It also wasn't a face that was particularly practiced at softening things. "I don't know," he said. And she believed him, which was interesting because she was finding it difficult to believe much of anything at the moment. He knocked on the door. A woman's voice called from inside. Just a moment. And Gideon Mercer reached into his coat, produced what appeared to be a week's worth of paper currency, and set it on top of the trunk with a small flat stone from the porch railing to hold it down. "That's too much," Evelyn said immediately. "It'll cover a week." "I'm not your charity." He looked at her steadily. "No, you're not." He said it simply, without any particular weight, like he was simply correcting an inaccurate statement. "Consider it a loan if you want. You can settle it later." The door opened. Clara Alderman was a round-faced woman in her 50s with flour on her forearms and the brisk, appraising manner of someone who had been running a boarding house long enough to read people quickly and had been correct often enough to trust her readings. "Gideon," she said, with the ease of genuine familiarity. Then she looked at Evelyn, and something moved through her expression, a quick, soft thing that was there and gone, that told Evelyn the woman knew exactly who she was and exactly what situation she'd arrived in. "This is Evelyn Harper," Gideon said. "She needs a room." "Of course she does," Clara said, and her tone was entirely warm, without a trace of anything that could be called condescension, which Evelyn registered and was quietly grateful for. "Come in out of the cold, honey. I'll put the kettle on." Gideon lifted the trunk over the threshold. He set it inside the entry hall and straightened his coat. "I'll leave you to it," he said, to Evelyn specifically. "Mr. Mercer?" He paused, hand already on the door frame. She looked at him directly, because she was determined that whatever else had happened today, she would not be mealy-mouthed about it. "Why did you help?" He considered the question for what felt like a genuine moment, like he was actually interested in getting the answer right. "You were sitting on a platform in the dark by yourself," he said finally. "Seemed like somebody ought to do something about that." Then he walked back out into the evening and was gone. Clara Alderman made strong tea and didn't ask questions, which was its own form of kindness. She showed Evelyn to a room on the second floor, modest, clean, a window that faced the alley, and left her with a lamp and the implication that supper would be at 7 if she wanted it. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her trunk. Inside it, 2 good dresses, a skirt, and 3 shirtwaists in practical colors. Her mother's quilt, the one with the double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams, which she had brought because it was the only piece of home she'd let herself take. A small wooden box containing the letters, 47 of them, in chronological order, tied with the ribbon she'd removed from a hat she'd stopped wearing last winter. She didn't open the trunk. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the wall and thought about what she knew. She knew that she had arrived in Redstone Crossing, Montana, on the 23rd of September in the year 1889. She knew that no one had come to meet her. She knew that the station master had been careful about what he said, which meant he knew something he hadn't said. She knew that a stranger named Gideon Mercer had paid a week's lodging for a woman he'd never met, with no explanation beyond the words seemed like somebody ought to do something about that. She knew she had $11.30 in her purse. She knew her return ticket to Boston, if she could arrange one, would cost more than she had. She knew her family had thought this venture was a mistake and had said so, and that she had said, "I know what I'm doing," in a tone that had ended the conversation, and that she had been wrong. She sat with all of that for a while. Then she got up, washed her face in the basin on the washstand, straightened her collar in the small mirror above it, and went down to supper. There were 3 other boarders. 2 were men who worked at the mill up the valley and spoke mostly to each other about things Evelyn didn't have context for. The 3rd was a young woman named Patsy Durbin, perhaps 19, with a sharp, lively face and the nervous energy of someone who moved through the world at a slightly faster speed than everyone around her. Patsy sat across from Evelyn and watched her with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't yet decided if social circumspection was worth the bother. "You're the woman from Boston," Patsy said, during a lull in which one of the millmen was attending to his potatoes. I am, Evelyn said. Silas Rowan was supposed to meet you. He was. Patsy picked at something on the tablecloth. He's not a good man, she said, in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested this was simply a piece of existing information she was making available. I don't mean to speak harshly about someone you came all this way to meet, but since you're already here, it seems more useful to tell you than not. Evelyn set down her fork. What do you know about him? Patsy glanced toward Clara in the kitchen doorway, but Clara had turned away to the stove. He's done this before, she said, lowering her voice a measure. Not just you. There was a woman from Ohio about 2 years back. She came on the spring train. He wasn't here for her either. A pause. She went back. The silence at the table had a particular quality. Not hostile, not even uncomfortable. Just the silence of people pretending they weren't listening. Where is he? Evelyn asked. His ranch is east, like people say. But he's got a wife out there, has had for years. Patsy said it quickly, like she'd been waiting to say it and wanted to get through it before she lost her nerve. Not everyone in town knows the whole of it, but some do. Enough. Evelyn picked up her fork again. She cut a piece of the roast Clara had made, which was good, better than she'd expected, which said something about her expectations at this point. Thank you for telling me, she said. Patsy looked at her with surprise, like she'd been braced for a different reaction. You're not... She stopped. I'm not going to fall apart at the supper table, Evelyn said, but thank you. She ate the rest of her supper and helped Clara clear the table without being asked, and went back upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and fell apart there instead, because some things are private even when there's no one to show them to. She was awake before 5 in the morning, which was not unusual for her. She lay in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the building. The creak of it settling, a mouse somewhere in the wall, wind finding the gap under the window. At some point during the night, something had shifted. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't resolution exactly, and it wasn't acceptance. It was closer to the feeling she'd had as a girl when she'd fallen out of the elm tree in her grandmother's yard and lain on the ground for a long moment taking inventory. What hurt? What worked? What she could stand up on. She'd come up with 2 scraped palms, a bruised hip, and her pride, which mended faster than she'd expected. She had $11.30. She had skills that she knew were real and that other people consistently underestimated because they lived in a female body. She had a week of lodging, already paid. She had a situation that was genuinely bad, and she was still breathing, and those were the materials she had to work with. She got up. By the time Clara came downstairs at 6, Evelyn had built the fire back up in the kitchen stove, put the coffee on, and located where the flour and the good tin were kept. Clara stopped in the doorway and looked at her. I hope you don't mind, Evelyn said. I couldn't sleep, and I didn't want to just sit. Clara looked at the fire, the coffee, the neat stack of items Evelyn had organized on the work table. Mind? She said. Honey, if you want to cook breakfast, I'm going to sit down. She sat down. Evelyn made biscuits because she'd been making them since she was 9, and it was one of the few tasks she could do without thinking. And not thinking was useful this morning. She cut them out and put them in the oven and found the salt pork hanging in the cold cupboard and cut slices and got those going in the cast iron pan. And by the time the millmen came down the stairs, the kitchen smelled like something worth getting out of bed for. She got compliments from both of them, which surprised her, and a look from Clara that was more than a compliment because it contained something speculative and measuring in it. You're not going back to Boston, Clara said, when the men had taken their plates to the table. No, Evelyn said. I'm not. Clara nodded, like this had confirmed something. Do you have work? Not yet. What can you do? Evelyn wiped her hands on the cloth she'd tucked into her waistband. Cook, apparently. Keep accounts. I've got a head for figures, so I worked for my father's import business for 4 years keeping his books. I can read contracts, identify discrepancies, organize filing systems. She paused. I sew reasonably well. I'm not fast, but I'm accurate. Clara was quiet for a moment. Accounts, she said. Numbers especially. She hesitated because saying I have a gift for numbers sounded presumptuous, even when it was accurate. I find it easy to see where the problems are in a set of books, patterns other people miss. Clara drummed her fingers on the table twice. There's a man in this town, she said, who needs exactly that and is too proud to ask for it properly. Evelyn waited. Gideon Mercer, Clara said. His ranch books are a disaster, have been since his wife passed 3 years back. She handled the accounts, and when she was gone, he just let them go. The man can run cattle and build fence and do the work of 2 men from dawn to dark, but ask him to reconcile a ledger and he'd rather move the mountain. She looked at Evelyn steadily. He's not easy to work for. He's quiet in the way that can seem unfriendly until you know him, but he's honest as the day is long, which out here is rarer than it ought to be. He paid my room, Evelyn said. I know. He didn't ask anything for it. He wouldn't. Clara stood up, began moving toward the stove again. If you want, I can mention to him that you're looking for work. He'd never come ask for himself. That would mean admitting his books are in the state they're in. But if the conversation happened naturally, and you were in it, I'd rather ask him myself, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her with what was rapidly becoming Evelyn's favorite expression in Redstone Crossing. The slightly surprised look that people had when she did something that wasn't what they'd expected a woman from Boston to do. All right, Clara said simply. To come. She found him at the livery, which was the most logical place to look for a man who had ridden into town, and which Evelyn had concluded by the straightforward method of asking herself where a rancher would be if he'd arrived on horseback and needed to leave again. The livery was at the north end of Main Street, run by a taciturn man named Holt, who appeared to communicate primarily through chin movements. She asked him if Gideon Mercer was around, and he moved his chin toward the back. And she walked through the smells of horse and hay and manure and found Gideon Mercer in a back stall checking the front left hoof of a dark bay horse with the focused competence of a man who had been doing it since he was young enough that it was simply part of how his hands knew how to move. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. Miss Harper, he said, in a tone that was neither warm nor unfriendly, merely noting her presence. Mr. Mercer. She stopped at the stall gate. I want to discuss a business arrangement. He set the horse's hoof down, straightened, and gave her his full attention in the way she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He wasn't a man who half paid attention to things. All right, he said. I've been told your accounts are in a poor state. She watched for the reaction. His jaw tightened slightly. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? A pause that answered the question adequately. What's your proposal? 40 cents a day to start. I come to the ranch with appropriate propriety, whatever arrangement you think is right for that. And I work the books until they're current and clean. When I've done that and you've seen the quality of the work, we renegotiate. She'd calculated the 40 cents on the walk over, enough to begin setting aside money without making the rate so high he'd refuse on principle, because she'd already read enough about him to know he'd refuse a number that felt like charity. I provide my own materials. You provide transportation if the road requires it. He watched her for a moment. You know books? I know books. My books specifically are... He stopped. I've seen bad books before, she said. I won't judge how they got that way. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, somewhere further back. You'd need a way to get out to the ranch. I can ride if you have something steady. I have a mule that's steady. She's not fast. Fast isn't what I need. He was quiet for another moment. He had a way of considering things that was not indecisive. It was more like he was measuring the thing against some internal standard before committing. She understood that impulse. She did the same thing, though her version of it moved faster. I'll need to see what you can do first, he said. I've got receipts from the last 3 years in a box in the house. You organize those by month and category. We'll talk about terms. When? I could take you out Monday if the weather holds. Monday, she agreed. He nodded. She turned to leave. Miss Harper? She paused, hand on the stall post. You want to know what I know about Silas Rowan, he said. It wasn't really a question. She turned back. I want to know what the town knows and isn't telling me. He studied her face for a moment, then he said, He's done this at least twice before. There are people in town who knew it when you arrived and didn't say anything because it wasn't their business to get involved. But they watched, Evelyn said. They watched, he agreed. And what stopped them from saying something? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, the same thing that stops people from doing a lot of things. They didn't want the trouble of it. And you paid my room. I paid your room. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing complicated in his expression. No attempt to make something more of the moment than it was. Why? She asked. I already told you why. You told me someone should do something. That's not the same as explaining why it was you who did it. He was quiet for a moment. Because I watched the train leave and you were still standing there, he said. And I know what that looks like. Waiting for something that's already gone. He paused. My wife died on a Wednesday. I stood in this livery for 2 hours after they told me before I could figure out what to do next. That particular kind of alone has a look to it. I recognized it. The stall was quiet except for the horse moving its weight and the distant sound of Main Street. I'm sorry about your wife, Evelyn said. I'm sorry about your situation, he said. They stood in the honest awkwardness of two people who had exchanged real things with each other and weren't sure where that put them. Monday, Evelyn said finally. Monday, he confirmed. She walked back through the livery and out into the gray morning air of Redstone Crossing, which smelled like cold earth and coming weather and the smoke from a dozen chimneys, and which was not Boston, and which was not what she'd come for, and which was nonetheless the place she was in. She still had $11.30. She had work starting Monday. She had a room with a blue door and a woman inside it who sat down while Evelyn made biscuits without being asked. She walked back down Main Street with her chin level and her spine straight, because the watching was still happening. She could feel the town's quiet peripheral attention on her the way you feel weather changing. And she had decided that whatever Redstone Crossing was going to make of Evelyn Harper, it was going to start here, with this walk, with this particular set of her shoulders. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the cottonwoods, and the leaves that were left spun in it briefly before settling, and the sky stayed the color of old pewter and showed no particular interest in improving. She walked on. Monday arrived with frost on the ground and a sky that had finally committed to something. Pale blue, hard and clear, the kind of cold morning that made every edge in the landscape sharp enough to cut. Gideon Mercer came to the Alderman house at 7:30 with the mule he'd promised, a broad-barreled gray animal named Ruth, who regarded Evelyn with the deeply unimpressed expression that mules reserve for people they haven't decided about yet. She won't throw you, Gideon said, holding the lead rope while Evelyn got herself settled in the saddle. She might stop walking if she sees something she doesn't like. What does she not like? Mostly sudden noises, loud men. Once she stopped for 20 minutes because there was a hat in the road. Evelyn looked down at Ruth. Ruth looked at the middle distance. We'll get along, Evelyn said. They rode out of town in the early morning quiet, Gideon on his bay and Evelyn on Ruth, who turned out to move at a pace that could most charitably be described as deliberate. The road east cut across a stretch of open grassland before climbing into the foothills through a series of switchbacks that gave her, in pieces, the kind of view she'd read about in geography books and not quite believed was real. The mountains to the north carried their first permanent snow now, white above the timberline, gray rock below it, and the whole range ran along the horizon like something that had been placed there specifically to remind people of their scale. She didn't say any of that. It seemed like the kind of thing Gideon Mercer probably already knew and didn't need commented on. They didn't talk much on the ride out. He pointed out a landmark once, a particular rock formation on a ridgeline, and told her it was useful for navigation if the weather came down fast. She filed it away. He mentioned that the road got muddy in a low section after hard rain, and that Ruth knew where the solid ground was if you gave her the rein. She filed that away too. The Mercer Ranch came into view after about 40 minutes, longer than 14 miles should have taken, but Ruth was not a horse who recognized urgency as a concept. It was a working property without apology about it. The main house was a solid log and frame structure, 2 stories, a covered porch running the full front length, a barn to the left, 2 outbuildings behind it, a loading pen and a stretch of fencing that ran east until it disappeared in the rise of the land. Everything showed wear in the way that honest use wear looks. Not neglect exactly, but the evidence of a man who had more work than hours and had been making those choices alone for a while. A hand named Cobb met them at the barn, a lean, weathered man of around 50 who had the efficient movement of someone who'd spent decades being useful. He took the horses without being asked and gave Evelyn a brief, neutral nod that she appreciated for what it wasn't, which was the particular kind of evaluating look she'd been getting for most of Redstone Crossing. Gideon led her inside. The house was cleaner than she'd expected, which said something about him, and less warm than a house with a woman in it would have been, which said something else. The furniture was solid and functional. There were no decorative objects she could see, except for a small frame drawing on the mantelpiece. A pencil sketch of this house, done from a slight distance, competently rendered. She didn't ask about it. He took her through to the kitchen and into a small room off the back that might have been intended as a study or a larder, or possibly both. On the table in that room was a wooden crate. Inside the crate were papers, receipts, ledger pages, folded letters that appeared to be invoices or contracts, a small bound book that was clearly meant to be an account ledger but which had been used inconsistently at best. The whole thing had the look of a system that had started with intention and then simply stopped, like a clock that had wound down. 3 years, he said, from the doorway. About what I expected, she said, which was true. She'd seen worse. Her father had a business partner once whose books had looked like they'd been kept by someone actively trying to obscure what was happening, though in that case it turned out that was precisely what was happening. This was different. This was just stopped, frozen at a particular date and then abandoned. She looked up. He was watching her assess it, with the slightly braced expression of a man waiting for judgment. I'm not going to tell you this is a disaster, she said. It's manageable. It's just been sitting. Something in his shoulders dropped about a quarter inch. You'll need to leave me to it, she said. I can't work if someone's watching. I'll be in the barn, he said, and was gone before she'd finished setting her coat on the chair. She worked for 6 hours. She started by sorting, not organizing yet, just sorting, because you had to understand what you were dealing with before you could decide how to deal with it. She made 4 piles: receipts, invoices, what appeared to be cattle sale records, and everything else. The everything else pile was the smallest, which was good. She found a piece of paper underneath the crate that turned out to be a partial reconciliation from 3 years previous, which she recognized by the handwriting, smaller, neater than Gideon's occasional notations, as belonging to someone else. His wife's work, she guessed, from its date. She set it aside carefully and thought about what it meant to find a woman's last practical work preserved under a box without anyone intending to preserve it. Then she stopped thinking about that and got back to the numbers. By noon, she had the 3 years sorted into months. By 2 o'clock, she'd begun working through the oldest records, cross-referencing receipts with the ledger entries where entries existed and noting discrepancies where they didn't. There was a pattern to the errors, not fraud, nothing sinister, but a cattle sale in the 2nd year that had been recorded twice, and a feed purchase in the 3rd year that hadn't been recorded at all, and about 6 months where it appeared no entries had been made because no entries had been made. And it took her longer to work out what was missing than it would have to simply look at records that existed. Gideon appeared in the doorway at around 3 in the afternoon. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he stood at the door long enough to determine she was at a stopping point before he came in. She'd noted, in the hours she'd been working, that the house wasn't entirely silent. She could hear distantly the sounds of the barn and the yard, the particular sounds of productive work that have their own rhythm. She'd found it easier to concentrate than she'd expected. He set 1 cup on the edge of the table, not on her papers, which she noticed, and stood back. How bad? He asked. It's not bad, she said. It's incomplete. There's a difference. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the 2nd-year entry she'd identified as duplicated. This sale was recorded twice. You paid yourself once, which means either the original entry was made in error, or there's a payment record somewhere I haven't found yet. He leaned over to look at it. He was close enough that she could smell horses and cold air and something like wood shavings on his coat. That was the Bellamy sale, he said, after a moment. 2 separate buyers. I might have written the first buyer's payment and then written the whole thing again when the second came in. Do you have the receipts from both buyers? Probably in that pile. She found them in about 90 seconds. He watched her do it. Both payments are accounted for, she said. The total in your ledger is wrong, but the money is right. It means your recorded balance is lower than it should be by, she did the arithmetic quickly, $63. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's where it went. Where what went? I couldn't figure out why the books in the bank didn't match. I assumed I'd spent something I didn't remember spending. He straightened. I moved money out of the operating account in the spring because I thought I was shorter than I was. You weren't shorter. No. He looked at the ledger, then at her. I restructured a loan I didn't need to restructure. She said nothing. It wasn't her place to comment on that. He picked up his coffee, looked at the wall. How long to finish the rest of it? 2 more days of this kind of work. Possibly 3 if I find other errors like that one. She paused. You have a good record of your cattle numbers. The livestock accounting is cleaner than everything else. That I always kept up with. A slight pause. Margaret handled the rest. She understood now why the ledger had stopped where it had stopped. I can set up a system going forward, she said, simpler than what was here before. One you can maintain yourself if you keep at it weekly. He looked at her. I'd rather keep you doing it. She hadn't expected that, quite so directly. That's a conversation for when I've finished the initial work, she said. Fair enough. He moved toward the door. I'll have Cobb drive you back before dark. I can ride Ruth. Ruth takes 45 minutes. It'll be dark in an hour. She started to argue and then recognized that it was a logistics problem, not a pride problem. All right, she said. He was nearly through the door when she said, Mr. Mercer. He stopped. The drawing on your mantelpiece. Who did it? A pause, not particularly long. Margaret, he said. She liked to draw. Then he went back out to the barn, and she went back to the numbers, and neither of them said anything else until Cobb came to get her. She came back Thursday, and again the following Monday, and by the end of that second week she had the 3 years of records organized, reconciled, and transferred into a clean ledger with a system she'd written out in simple steps on a card she tacked to the inside of the cover. The discrepancy she'd found had turned out to be the only significant error. Everything else was present, just unsorted, undated, and sitting in a crate where it couldn't do anyone any good. She and Gideon renegotiated terms on a Thursday afternoon in early October, standing in the cold kitchen while he made coffee badly, the way men make coffee when they've been doing it for themselves too long, and have stopped expecting it to be good. 3 days a week, she said. Until the end of the year. We reassess in January. What would you be doing the other days, he asked. Clara needs help with the house accounts. She's been doing them herself, and she's not wrong about them, but they'd be faster and cleaner with a second eye. She'd arranged that on Wednesday, after Clara had asked what Evelyn was doing, and Evelyn had told her. It keeps me from sitting idle. What rate? Same rate for Clara's work. Yours I'd like to raise to 55 cents. He looked at her over the coffee pot. 55. The initial reconciliation was worth more than 40 cents a day. I'm offering you a discount in consideration of the ongoing arrangement. She said it evenly, the way she'd say anything factual. She'd thought it through the night before. The number was right. He was quiet for a moment. All right. She hadn't quite expected him to agree without negotiating and wasn't sure what to do with that, so she just nodded and got out her materials. The work settled into a pattern. She came Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on Ruth, who had by this point decided Evelyn was acceptable, and occasionally deigned to move at a pace approaching brisk when the weather was cold enough to motivate her. Cobb would be in the yard when she arrived, and he'd take Ruth and nod, and she'd go to the back room and work. Gideon would bring coffee in the morning at some point, without asking, without comment, just set it on the corner of the table and leave. And at midday she'd find something to eat from whatever was in the kitchen, which was always plain and often insufficient, and she started bringing her own lunch because she couldn't concentrate in the afternoons if she was hungry. She reorganized the supply ordering system in the second week of October. She found that Gideon was purchasing feed in quantities that made sense for a larger operation than he was currently running, and that by adjusting his order schedule, he could reduce his monthly outlay by nearly $30 without running short. She told him at the end of the day, showed him the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. That's a lot of money, he said. Over a year, yes. I didn't see it. You're not in the habit of looking at it this way, she said. That's what the records are for. He looked up from the paper. What else don't I see? It wasn't a rhetorical question. She'd realized in the weeks she'd been working that Gideon Mercer asked questions because he wanted the answers, not because he was filling conversational space. It was a quality she found increasingly unusual and increasingly valuable. Your winter feed supply is right, she said. Your equipment maintenance is about 6 weeks ahead of where it should be, which means you've been replacing things early. That's either very cautious or slightly wasteful, depending on whether those replacements were necessary. Some were, he said. Some probably weren't. Then going forward, we log when something gets replaced and why. In 2 years, you'll have a record that tells you when things actually need to go and when they still have life in them. He said. She heard it and chose not to comment on it. Quote, October became November, and the cold settled in with the particular serious intention of Montana autumn, which was not playing a game. The road between town and the ranch acquired a layer of ruts in the mud that froze solid overnight and made Ruth navigate with extra care and less dignity. Evelyn wore 2 pairs of stockings and the heavier of her 2 coats and still arrived cold, which Gideon apparently noticed because the stove in the back room started being lit before she got there. She didn't comment on that either. What she noticed, without making much of it, was that the work had changed character. It was no longer purely recovery work, the sorting and reconciling of what had accumulated, but something ongoing. She was maintaining current records, tracking expenses as they happened, preparing for the end of the tax year with documentation that would actually be usable. She built a simple monthly summary format and showed Gideon how to read it, which took 2 sessions because the first session went wrong when he tried to understand it all at once and got frustrated in the quiet, compressed way that was apparently how frustration looked on him. "Stop," she'd said the first time. He'd looked up from the summary with an expression that was clearly a man working hard to manage something that wasn't cooperating. "You're trying to understand all of it at once," she said. "Look at just the top line first. That's your total income for the month. Is it more or less than the month before?" He looked at the top line. "Less? Why is October less than September?" "Cattle sale in September." He paused. "No major sale in October." "Right. Now the second line. That's your fixed expenses. Things you pay regardless. Is that number stable?" He looked. "Yes." "Good. Everything under that is variable. When you have a question about a variable number, that's when you ask me." She tapped the page. "You don't have to understand all of it. You have to understand enough to know what questions to ask." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's more useful than the way I was trying to do it." "I know." He looked at her, and there it was again. That almost expression, the possibility of a smile that didn't quite arrive. "You could have said that to begin with." "You needed to try it wrong first," she said. "Otherwise it doesn't stick." He gave a short, low sound that might have been a laugh. She wasn't entirely certain, as it was quiet enough to be ambiguous, and went back to the summary. She thought about that sound on the ride home, the way it had come out of him, surprised and genuine and quickly contained, like something that had gotten out before he'd thought to stop it. November deepened. The evenings shortened to the point where she was frequently at the ranch as the light began to go, and on 2 occasions Gideon drove her back himself because Cobb was occupied with something in the barn and Ruth was not a nighttime animal if it could be helped. Those drives were quiet, but not uncomfortably so. They were the kind of quiet that 2 people fall into when they've been working alongside each other long enough that silence doesn't require explanation. It was on one of those drives that he told her, without any particular build-up, that his father had run the ranch before him and had been terrible with money in the way some men are, not dishonest, just constitutionally incapable of tracking where it went, and that Gideon had grown up understanding the work and the cattle and the land as things he knew in his body. But the paper side of it had always felt like a foreign language he'd been expected to learn without anyone teaching him. "Margaret learned it," he said, "so I let it be hers." "And then she was gone," Evelyn said, "and I didn't know what I didn't know." A pause. The wagon moved over a rough section of road. "I knew the bank balance was wrong. I didn't know how to find where." "Most people can't," she said. "It's not a natural skill." "You make it look natural." "I've been doing it since I was 17, she said. "My father thought my older brother would take over the accounts eventually, but my brother thought numbers were boring and I was already better at it than either of them, so—" She stopped. It was more than she'd intended to say. "So you did the work and let someone else get the credit for it," he said. She turned to look at him in the last of the light. His eyes were on the road. "Something like that," she said. He didn't push it further, but she had the sense, riding the rest of the way in the dark, with the cold coming down off the mountains and the horses breathing steam into the air, that he'd understood more than she'd said, and had filed it away in the same methodical way he filed everything else that he decided mattered. She was still turning that over when she got back to her room at the Alderman house. Outside, Redstone Crossing had gone quiet in the way small towns go quiet in winter, which was an early and complete quiet. Nothing like Boston's nighttime, which was never entirely silent. She sat on her bed and thought about what she had built in the past 6 weeks. Not what she'd lost, not what she'd come here for, not the bundle of letters in the bottom of her trunk that she hadn't opened since the night she arrived. What she had built. She had work she was good at and was being paid honestly for. She had a room in a house where she was known and where her presence was genuinely useful. She had a collection of small routines that made each day structurally sound. The early mornings with Clara, the rides to and from the ranch, the particular satisfaction of a ledger page that reconciled exactly. She had, she supposed, the beginnings of something that, if she was careful with it and didn't examine it too hard, might eventually be called a place. She hadn't been waiting for Silas Rowan for some time now. She was surprised to realize it, and then surprised that she was surprised. It was possible, she thought, that the process of stopping waiting had simply happened on its own, like ice thawing. Not through any decision she'd made, but through the accumulated weight of days that asked her to be present in them, and she had been, and the waiting had run out of room. Through the window, the Montana sky was completely dark and completely full of stars in the way that only happens when the air is cold and clean and there are no city lights to argue with them. She looked at it for a long time before she blew out the lamp. The first snow of real consequence came in the second week of November and stayed. Not the decorative kind that coats things lightly and melts by afternoon, but the kind that arrives with intention and begins immediately rearranging what's possible. The road to the Mercer Ranch became a negotiation between Ruth's judgment and the terrain's indifference, and Evelyn learned to read the mule's ears. Forward meant manageable, sideways meant pay attention, flatback meant stop and wait, in the way you learn to read any language when it's the one being spoken around you. She was working on the December supply projections on a Friday morning when she found the contract. It was tucked inside the back cover of the oldest ledger, not hiding exactly, just placed there at some point and not removed, the way papers migrate in houses where record-keeping has lapsed. She almost set it aside without reading it, because her job was numbers and this was a document, and she'd trained herself not to overreach the scope of what she'd been hired to do. But the name at the top stopped her. Silas Rowan, party of the first part. She read it twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. Then she read it a third time, more slowly. It was a land agreement, not a purchase contract, but something more complicated, a kind of partnership arrangement dated 14 months prior, before she'd left Boston, before the letters had started arriving. The document described a parcel of grazing land that sat on the eastern boundary of Gideon's property, land that the document referred to as disputed acreage, approximately 400 acres that both Gideon Mercer and Silas Rowan apparently held competing claims to, and this agreement was supposed to resolve the dispute through a co-management arrangement while the claims were formally reviewed. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at the document again. There were 2 signatures at the bottom, Gideon's, which she recognized from his occasional notes in the ledger, and Rowan's, a big looping signature that took up more space than it needed to. She closed the ledger carefully, put the contract on top of it, and went out to the barn. Gideon was in the middle stall, working on a section of harness that had cracked along one of the traces. He had a piece of leather and an awl, and was doing the work with the focused, economical movements she'd come to recognize as his normal mode of operation. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face before she said anything. "What did you find?" he said. She held out the contract. He set down the harness and took it, and she watched him read it. Not his face, exactly, because his face wasn't a document she could read easily, but his hands, which tightened slightly on the paper near the end. "I should have told you he was involved in something with the ranch," he said. He wasn't apologizing. He was stating a fact about an omission. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He handed the contract back to her. "The land dispute has been going on for 3 years. It was my father's problem before it was mine. That parcel, the East 400, my father broke it from a larger section in the 1870s, and there's a question about whether the original survey was right. Rowan bought the neighboring property about 4 years ago and immediately claimed the acreage was part of his deed. And this agreement was supposed to keep it out of the courts until there was a formal survey done. He paused. The survey was supposed to happen last spring. Did it? No. His jaw moved. Rowan kept finding reasons to delay it. She looked at the contract, then at him. You didn't think to mention this when I found his name in your records. I thought about it, he said. I decided it was a separate matter from the accounts. It's not a separate matter if he's involved with your property. I know that. There was a flatness in his voice that wasn't anger exactly, but was close to it. The contained, effortful kind of flatness that happens when a man is holding something down because letting it up would not be useful. I didn't want his name in this house any more than it had to be. She understood that, and she didn't push it further, but she took the contract back to the workroom and added it to the file she'd built for documents requiring attention. Some things had to be held even when you didn't want to touch them. She said nothing more about it that day. But on the ride home, with the snow coming down in the light, unhurried way it had when it wasn't in any particular hurry, because it had all the time it needed, she thought about what it meant that Silas Rowan had been, for the past 14 months, a man with a legal arrangement connecting him to Gideon Mercer's property. A man who had, at some point during those same months, been writing letters to a woman in Boston describing a ranch and a kitchen window and a future. She thought about the timing of things, the way a man might use a correspondence to distract or to establish something in the record. A woman traveling to marry him, a woman arriving to confirm his stability, his legitimacy, his claim to the kind of settled life that came with a wife. She didn't know if that was what had happened, but she turned it over in her mind all the way back to town and didn't arrive at a reason to dismiss it. The question she couldn't answer was answered for her on a Tuesday in late November when Patsy Durbin came to the Alderman house at 8:15 in the morning with her coat not fully buttoned and her hair still in its sleeping braid, and the expression of someone who has learned something and made the calculation that waiting is the wrong choice. I need to tell you something, she said to Evelyn in the hallway before she'd even been offered to come inside properly. And I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else, because you will hear it from someone else. Because Frank Aldridge was in the saloon last night, and apparently Frank Aldridge cannot keep anything in his head for more than a few hours. Evelyn took her coat off a hook and put it on over her dress. Come into the kitchen, she said. Clara was at the stove and looked at Patsy and looked at Evelyn and moved her coffee cup to the far side of the room and occupied herself with something at the window that was not listening, except that Clara Alderman heard everything that happened in her kitchen and both of them knew it. Patsy sat down. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them, then at Evelyn. Silas Rowan has a wife, she said. I told you that before. What I didn't tell you, because I didn't know all of it, is that the woman in Ohio, the one who came 2 years ago on the spring train, she went back, yes, but she didn't go back without doing anything. She wrote a letter to the county sheriff here before she left. It's been sitting in the records because the sheriff at the time didn't think it warranted an investigation. A woman claiming she'd been lied to through the mail wasn't, apparently, a pressing matter. And now, Evelyn said, the county sent a new man in September. New sheriff, name of Calloway, came in from Billings. He's been reviewing old complaints. Patsy looked up. He found her letter, and apparently he found 3 others after he started looking. The kitchen was very quiet. 3 others? Evelyn said. Women who wrote letters to the county, different counties, over about 5 years. Same thing every time. Letters from a man describing a ranch and a future, women who traveled and found nothing. Patsy paused. You're not the first and you're not the last. There was a woman from Pennsylvania who came in the spring, 3 months before you. She left after a week. Evelyn looked at the table. She didn't tell anyone. She told Earl Potts. Earl apparently wrote it down and then didn't do anything with it because the previous sheriff was, Earl's words, not mine, not the type to make trouble for a man with land. Patsy said it with the careful, precise diction of someone quoting rather than editorializing. Sheriff Calloway is apparently a different type. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of Evelyn without being asked. Evelyn didn't pick it up. He's been already married, Evelyn said. Not a question. For 11 years. A woman named Dora lives on the main ranch property. They have 2 children. A pause. Whether she knows about the letters, I don't know. The thing that arrived in Evelyn's chest at that moment was not what she would have expected. if she'd tried to predict her own reaction. She had expected anger, the hot, spiking kind that she'd kept so carefully banked since September, or humiliation in a new and worse form. What arrived instead was something almost like exhaustion, a profound, bone-deep tiredness of the particular specific shape of this man and this lie, and the energy she'd been spending, without entirely knowing it, holding it all at a careful distance. 5 women, maybe more. 5 women who had sat in rooms and believed the words and letters and done the arithmetic of a future. "Where's Rowan now?" she asked. "His property, east of town. He's been there all fall. Hasn't come to town much." Patsy hesitated. "He knows you're still here. Apparently he expected you to leave like the others." "He expected wrong," Evelyn said. She picked up the coffee. She drank some of it. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway because it was something to do with her hands. "What are you going to do?" Patsy asked. "I'm going to finish the supply projections I was working on this morning," Evelyn said. "And then I'm going to find out when Sheriff Calloway is receiving visitors." She did both of those things. She finished the projections. The numbers were not going to organize themselves because a man named Silas Rowan had decided to use the mail as an instrument of cruelty. And then she put on her second coat and walked to the small building at the south end of town that now had a proper sign out front reading Redstone Crossing Sheriff's Office, T. Calloway. Calloway was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s maybe, with a direct manner and the careful, slightly formal courtesy of someone who'd been trained to take women's accounts seriously and was doing so deliberately rather than naturally. She didn't hold that against him. Deliberate was functional. She told him everything clearly and without embellishment. The letters, all 47 of them, which she'd gone home and brought with her after finishing the projections, because she'd decided on the walk to his office that she would not walk in without the evidence in her hand. The dates, the content, the specific promises made, the specific nature of the deception. She told him about Patsy's information and about the woman from Ohio and the woman from Pennsylvania. She told him about the land dispute with Gideon's property, because she didn't know if it was relevant to his investigation, but she suspected it might be, and omitting it because of how complicated it made things seem like exactly the kind of mistake that had let this go on as long as it had. Calloway took notes. He asked careful questions. He read several of the letters with the focused attention of a man building a case. "You understand," he said when she'd finished, "that the legal remedy here is limited. Corresponding dishonestly with a woman isn't... There's no statute that addresses this cleanly. What he did to you is an injury without a clean name in the law as it currently stands." "I understand that," she said. "What there may be," he continued, "is fraud. If he used correspondence to secure financial advantage, if any of the women sent money, or if this connects to property claims like the land dispute you mentioned, that's different. That's something I can pursue." "I didn't send money," Evelyn said. "I spent money to get here, but I sent nothing to him. The others may have different stories." He set his notes down. "Miss Harper, I want to be honest with you. This investigation may take months. I can't promise you an outcome that feels like justice, because the law isn't always built for that. What I can do is follow what's there and see where it leads." "That's all I'm asking," she said. She walked home from the sheriff's office in the late afternoon through a main street that had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet in winter. Less foot traffic, the cold keeping people in, and she passed the hardware store and the general store and the building where Earl Potts sat in his station house and had decided in September that what he knew wasn't his business to share. She didn't stop. She kept walking. She hadn't planned to tell Gideon. It wasn't his problem in the specific personal sense, and she'd made a practice of not making her personal business into something that needed to be managed by other people. But the following Monday, when she arrived at the ranch and sat down at the work table, she found she couldn't concentrate in the way she normally could. The numbers were there, the records were there, and she kept reading the same column twice without it landing. Gideon appeared in the doorway at his usual time with the coffee, and he took one look at her and set the cup down and said, "What happened?" "I found out more about Rowan," she said. "Tell me." So she did. She told him about Patsy's account, about the 5 women, about Sheriff Calloway and the investigation and the land dispute that she'd thought to mention because it might matter. She told it the way she did most things, plainly, in order, without dramatizing. And when she'd finished, Gideon was standing very still in the doorway with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that she'd never seen on him before. It was cold, not empty. There was plenty in it, but all of it was compressed and hard and entirely controlled. It was the face of a man who is angry in the particular way of someone who is very careful about anger because he knows what it can do if he isn't. He's been on my eastern boundary for 4 years, Gideon said. Very quiet. Yes. And for at least 2 of those years he's been using letters to... He stopped. Yes. A long silence. Somewhere outside, the wind worked at a loose board on the barn. Did you know about the other women when you came to me about the accounts? He asked. No, I knew about the woman from Ohio. I found out the rest last week. He looked at the wall. He dragged you out here, he said. He dragged 5 women out here. At least 5. And the sheriff he's investigating. Whether anything comes of it legally is uncertain. She paused. The land dispute may be the clearest legal path. If you use the correspondence to manipulate something connected to property claims, that's fraud. That has a statute. He was very quiet for a moment, then, I'll talk to my lawyer. I thought you might, she said. You mentioned it to Calloway because you thought I'd want to pursue it. I mentioned it because it might be relevant to his investigation. What you do with your property dispute is your own business. He looked at her. In the gray morning light of the back room, with the cold coming through the window seams and the ledgers stacked neatly on the shelf she'd organized in October, the look on his face shifted into something less controlled and more human, something that was not quite what she could name, but that she felt in the place behind her sternum like pressure. He's probably been delaying the survey on purpose, Gideon said. If the survey is completed, the acreage goes one way or the other and the dispute is settled. As long as it's unsettled, he has a claim. And if he needed to appear like a stable, settled man while the dispute was active, a man expecting a wife looks more settled than a man living alone on contested land, Evelyn said. Yes. His voice had gone very flat. She picked up her coffee. Let a moment pass. I'm going to finish the December projections today, she said. It would be useful if you could locate any correspondence you have from Rowan regarding the survey. Dates when it was promised, dates when he canceled, any reasons he gave. It'll matter to Calloway. He looked at her as if he was slightly surprised by the shift back to practical ground, and then something in his face settled. Not relaxing, but recalibrating. I have his letters in the office in the house, he said. I'll pull them. Good. He turned to go. Mr. Mercer. He paused. I know this is your land matter and has been for years before I arrived. I don't mean to step into it further than... You didn't step into it, he said. He dragged you into it. That's different. He said it in the tone he used for statements that were simply factual, and walked out, and she heard his boots on the hall floor and then the sound of the door that led to the front of the house. She put her hands flat on the table for a moment, steadied them. Then she opened the ledger and went back to the numbers. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and at some point Gideon returned and set a stack of papers near the edge of her table. Rowan's letters, she assumed, bound with a piece of twine, and didn't interrupt her work. She heard him move through the house and back out to the yard. She heard Cobb come and go. The normal sounds of the afternoon moved around her while she worked. When the light started to go, she closed the ledger, put her materials in order, and picked up the stack of letters. She untied the twine and read through them quickly. They were short, businesslike in tone, nothing like the letters she'd received, and that contrast landed with its own particular weight. Different handwriting, she noticed. In Rowan's letters to Gideon, the writing was cramped and practical. In the letters he'd sent her, the loops were larger, more performed, as if he'd developed a separate handwriting for the purpose of appearing like a different man. She retied the twine and set them in the document file she'd built. She sat for a moment in the dim room. What she felt sitting there was not the burning humiliation she'd expected to feel when she finally had the full shape of it. It was something quieter, and in some ways worse. A steady, clarifying anger that had found its form and didn't need to perform. He had looked at women and seen something to use. He had calculated that loneliness was a reliable opening. He had sat somewhere and composed letters designed to move women across a continent and then simply not shown up, because the showing up was never the point. The point was the letters themselves. The establishing of a claim. A woman in transit, or recently arrived, or waiting, A woman in correspondence with a man who held property was a woman whose existence could be made useful without ever honoring her. She picked up her coat and her bag. She was not going to disappear into this the way she suspected he'd expected her to. She was not going to be humiliated into silence and a return ticket and a story she told in a lowered voice for the rest of her life. The anger that had found its form was going to stay in that form, useful, directed, cold and clear as the December air outside. And she was going to be standing in Redstone Crossing when whatever came next arrived. Gideon was on the porch when she came out, leaning against the rail with his arms crossed against the cold, watching the last of the light go over the western ridge. He heard the door and turned. "I'm ready," she said, meaning the ride back. He nodded and moved toward the barn. Then he stopped. He turned around and looked at her in the way that she'd come to understand meant he'd been thinking about something and had decided to say it. "You came to me about the books when you had other options," he said. "You could have gone back to Boston. You could have waited for charity and taken it. You did none of that." She waited. "What he did," Gideon said slowly, "has nothing to do with what you chose to do after. Those are different things. I want you to know I understand that difference." She held his gaze. The cold had gone sharp in the way it went after sundown, and her breath made a small cloud and dispersed. "Most people don't," she said. "I know," he said. "Most people are going to look at you and see the woman who came out here for Silas Rowan. I'm going to look at you and see the woman who stayed anyway and made something of it." He paused. "I thought you should know that." He turned and went to the barn before she could answer, which was probably for the best, because she needed a moment before she could have answered without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. She stood on the porch of the Mercer Ranch in the Montana dark, with the cold coming down and the stars beginning to assert themselves overhead, and she breathed in and breathed out and let the moment be what it was without trying to make it larger or smaller. Then she followed him to the barn to get Ruth, and they rode back to Redstone Crossing in the dark, and neither of them said much, and it was the most understood she had felt since she'd arrived. December in Redstone Crossing was not subtle about itself. The cold came in layers. The first layer you could manage with a good coat, the second required wool underlayers and the discipline to keep moving, and the third, which arrived sometime around the middle of the month and simply stayed, was the kind of cold that made the air hurt going in and turned the world into a landscape of sharp edges and muffled sounds, where your own footsteps on packed snow were the loudest thing in any direction. Evelyn had adapted. She'd bought a second pair of wool stockings from the general store and a heavier pair of gloves and a scarf that Clara had helped her select, because Clara knew what winters here actually required as opposed to what a person from Massachusetts thought they knew about cold. She'd been wrong about that, the same way she'd been wrong about a number of things when she arrived, and she was trying to make a practice of being wrong gracefully, of updating her understanding without making a production of it. The investigation into Silas Rowan moved the way official things moved out here, which was slowly and not in straight lines. Sheriff Calloway had sent correspondence to 3 other county jurisdictions by mid-December, attempting to locate the women whose letters he'd found and obtain formal statements. He'd told Evelyn, at their second meeting, that 2 of the women had confirmed they were willing to submit written accounts. The third had not responded. The fourth, the woman from Pennsylvania who'd come in the spring and left, had apparently moved and her new address was unclear. "The land fraud angle is developing," Calloway had said, in the careful language of a man who had learned not to promise outcomes. "The survey delays appear to be documented and deliberate. My concern is that proving deliberate is different from proving it happened." "I understand the distinction," Evelyn said. "Your records from the Mercer property, the correspondence dates you compiled, that's the clearest timeline I have. It's useful." She'd spent an evening at the Alderman house constructing that timeline from the materials she had. Gideon's copies of Rowan's letters, her own received letters with their postmarks, the dates of the survey cancellations against the dates of her own correspondence arriving in Redstone Crossing. The pattern it revealed, laid out in a single column, was not ambiguous. Every survey cancellation had occurred within 2 weeks of Rowan sending a letter to Evelyn, as if one were being used as cover for the other. As if the appearance of a man in romantic correspondence, a man building a domestic future, were useful insulation against questions about why a land survey kept failing to materialize. She didn't know if that would hold up as legal argument. She wasn't a lawyer. but she'd given Calloway the timeline and let him determine its value. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how the investigation would move through the town itself. Small towns do not hold secrets in the way larger places can. Information spreads through them the way water spreads through dry ground, finding every crack. By mid-December, the general shape of what had happened was known to most of Redstone Crossing, and the specific shape of it, 5 women, a pattern of letters. A married man using correspondence for purposes that were still being formally named had produced a reaction in the town that Evelyn hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. People started being kind to her. Not in the watchful, cautious way they'd been in September when she was a woman in an embarrassing situation, but differently, with a directness that felt like recognition. The woman who ran the dry goods counter included a piece of ribbon in her order without charging for it. One of the millmen who boarded at the Alderman house told her, somewhat gruffly and without looking at her while he said it, that he hoped the sheriff did what needed doing. Earl Potts stopped her outside the station house one morning and said, "I should have said more when you arrived," in a voice that cost him something, and she said, "Yes, you should have," and neither of them elaborated. And he held the door open for her, and that was as close to settled as that was going to get. Gideon noticed the shift, too. He mentioned it once, on a Wednesday, when she arrived at the ranch and he was at the porch rather than the barn. "I hear the towns come around to your side of things," he said. "The towns come around to the facts," she said. "That's slightly different." He almost smiled. "Is it?" "Sides imply a contest. The facts aren't a contest, they're just what happened." "You sound like a lawyer." "I sound like a person who spent 3 months being careful about language," she said. "There's a difference between I was wronged and here is a documented pattern of behavior. One of them is easier to dismiss." He held the door open for her. "How do you learn to think like that?" "I had a father who was in business and not always honest about it," she said, going past him into the warmth of the house. "And I had to figure out, when I was 17, whether I was going to help him obscure things or help him fix them." She set her coat on the hook in the hall. "I fixed them. It took 2 years and it was complicated, and he was not grateful about it at the time, but the books were right afterward." "Was he grateful eventually?" She considered. "He was proud of me in a way that he couldn't say directly, so it came out sideways. He started introducing me to his business associates as his accountant instead of his daughter." A pause. "Which I suppose was his version." "Men do that," Gideon said. He went to put the coffee on, and she went to the back room, and the morning settled into its rhythm. The rhythm between them had changed without either of them naming it. It was a thing that happened gradually enough that she couldn't point to a specific day. It was more like a temperature change, the kind that happens over weeks, until you realize one morning that you've stopped wearing your heaviest coat because the air is different now. Their conversations had lengthened, not dramatically, not into territory that either of them seemed to have decided was safe or unsafe, just longer, more honest, covering more ground. He told her, on a Friday in late December, that he had been offered a fair price for the East Boundary land, the disputed 400 acres, by a neighboring rancher named Borden, who had no connection to Rowan and just wanted the grazing access. The offer had come in before the dispute with Rowan was formally resolved, which complicated it. "If I sell to Borden before the survey, I'm selling land whose status isn't clean," Gideon said. He was at the work table looking at a map he'd spread across the end of it. His property lines marked in his own hand, the disputed parcel shaded. "If I wait for the survey and it comes out in Rowan's favor, I've missed the offer." "What does your lawyer say?" "My lawyer is in Billings and costs me $1 an hour and has told me 3 things, none of which agree with each other." She looked at the map. "What do you want to do with the land if it's confirmed as yours?" He looked at it too. "Run cattle on it. What I've always done with my land." "Can you afford to wait for the survey on that basis?" "Financially, yes. The ranch isn't dependent on that acreage." "Then wait for the survey," she said. "Selling under uncertain title gives Rowan leverage he doesn't deserve. If the survey confirms your claim, you sell on clean terms or you keep it, your choice. If it confirms his claim, you've lost nothing you weren't already losing." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. "You're not just an accountant," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I'm not your lawyer either, so take that as what it is." "What is it?" A second opinion from someone who's looked at your records for 3 months and has some context. She looked at him. You're allowed to disagree with it. I'm not disagreeing with it, he said. I'm noting that you could charge more for this kind of advice. I know, she said. We can negotiate that in January. He did the not quite smile thing, and she went back to the current ledger, and he rolled up his map and went back to the barn, and that was that. But she thought about the exchange later, thought about the ease of it. Not a comfortable ease, exactly. Not the ease of people who've known each other a long time and have nothing left to discover, but the ease of people who have learned how to be honest with each other and have found that it holds weight. She'd had honest conversations in her life. With Clara sometimes, who was a straight-talking woman if she trusted you. With Patsy, who was constitutionally incapable of being indirect. But those conversations had a different quality from the ones with Gideon, and it took her until after Christmas to understand what the difference was. The difference was that Gideon listened the way he did everything else. Not performing attention, not waiting for his turn, but actually taking in what she said and holding it and incorporating it into what he said next. It made talking to him feel like talking to someone rather than talking at someone, and that was rarer than it should have been, and she knew it. Christmas at the Alderman house was Clara's particular achievement. A full table, good food, the millmen and Patsy and 2 women from the church auxiliary who were apparently regulars at Clara's table, and arrived with a pie each, and a general atmosphere of warmth that Clara maintained through a combination of genuine hospitality and the organizational capacity of someone who had been running a household for 30 years and did not leave warmth to chance. Evelyn had made a pie as well, apple, from the last of the stored apples, which were slightly past their prime, but still functional with enough sugar and cinnamon. And it had been received with honest appreciation rather than polite appreciation, which she'd learned to distinguish. She'd also made a card for Clara, written out carefully, saying simply that she was grateful for the week of lodging paid by someone else that had turned into 3 months of something that felt increasingly like home. Clara had read it at the kitchen table while the others were in the sitting room and had patted Evelyn's hand once and said, "You're a good woman, Evelyn Harper," in the direct, unembroidered way of a person who meant it precisely that literally. Gideon had not been at the table. She hadn't expected him. He was not, from what she understood, a man who sought out gatherings, but she'd thought of him once or twice during the day, in the way you think of someone who has become part of the regular furniture of your thinking. She found out later from Cobb that he'd spent Christmas with his brother's family in a town about 30 miles east. She hadn't known he had a brother. She filed that away with the other things she was filing, all the ordinary facts of a person that you accumulate over time without noticing you're building a picture. January came in cold and practical, the way New Year's tend to do after the brief warmth of the holiday week. She and Gideon sat down on the 5th of January to renegotiate her terms, as they'd agreed. She'd thought about what she wanted to propose, had written it out, had revised it twice because the first version was too conservative, and the second version was too aggressive, and the third was right. "Full time," she said, across the work table from him. "Monday through Saturday, half day. Accounts, correspondence management, and supply coordination. Rate of $1.20 per week." He looked at the paper where she'd written it out. "That's a fair rate." "It's a correct rate," she said. "It should have been higher 3 months ago, but we were both working with incomplete information." "What changed?" "I have a clearer picture of the scope of work. You have 3 months of results to evaluate." She paused. "Also, the supply reorganization I did in October has saved you $41 since then, which I calculate covers approximately 7 weeks of wages at the proposed rate, if you want to think of it that way. You've been keeping track of that." "I keep track of everything. That's the job." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper. Then, "There's a room off the kitchen that was used as a storage room. It's been empty for 2 years. If you wanted it, if the arrangement would be easier with a room here instead of the ride every day, that's an option." She sat very still. "The ride in winter is—" He stopped. Started again. "It's not practical. Ruth is a good animal, but the road isn't reliable in bad weather, and you've been doing the trip 6 days a week in conditions that—" Another stop. "It's a practical offer," he said. "There's a door with a lock. Cobb's room is in the barn. There's nothing improper about it that couldn't be managed." She studied his face. He was holding eye contact in the slightly effortful way he did when he was saying something that he'd decided needed to be said directly, even though direct was not his most comfortable mode. "I need to think about it," she said. "All right." Not because I doubt the practicality of it. She wanted to be clear about that. "I need to think about what it means for my standing in town." "I understand that." Clara's opinion would matter. "Clara would tell you to take it," he said, "because Clara is a practical woman." "Clara would tell me to think carefully," Evelyn said, "because Clara is a practical woman." He conceded this with a slight movement of his head. "The offer stands. You don't have to decide now." She thought about it for the rest of the day, and on the ride home, one of the last cold weather rides on Ruth she wanted to do, if she was honest, because the road had been treacherous last week and would be worse before it was better. She thought about what Gideon's offer actually was, underneath its practical surface. It was not, she was fairly certain, a proposition of any improper variety. That was not how he operated. What it was, more likely, was what it appeared to be. A man solving a logistics problem in the most efficient way available, which was his consistent mode of approaching everything. But it was also a man saying stay. In the particular language he used, which was the language of practical action rather than declaration. A man who could not say stay outright, perhaps, but who could identify a room with a lock and a door and offer it. She talked to Clara that evening, laying it out plainly. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. "What do you want to do?" Clara asked when Evelyn was done. "I asked what you think." "I know you did. I'm asking what you want." Evelyn looked at the window. Outside, the street was empty and dark and cold. "I think the ranch is where I do my best work," she said carefully. "I think the ride is genuinely a problem as the winter gets harder. I think the room is probably exactly what he says it is." "And the rest of it?" "What rest of it?" Clara gave her a look that said she was not going to play that particular game. "Gideon Mercer has not offered a room to anyone since his wife died," she said simply. "That is a fact about Redstone Crossing that I know to be true. Make of it what you make of it." Evelyn made of it what she made of it, which was something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet, and told Clara she'd give him an answer on Monday. She gave him her answer on Monday. She would take the room. She would pay a nominal amount toward board, a figure she'd calculated and that he accepted without argument, and she would maintain her arrangement with Clara for town days when she needed to be there. The terms were written out and both of them signed the paper, because she'd learned the hard way that things not written down had a way of being understood differently by different people. She moved in on a Wednesday. She had one trunk and a valise, and Gideon helped bring the trunk in without commenting on its weight, which was unchanged from September, and which she'd been told was excessive by several people between September and now. The room was small and had one window facing east. Someone had recently put a new piece of stovepipe up. She could tell by the color of the metal against the older fitting, and the floor had been swept recently. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall for her coat, and a shelf above the window. It was plain and functional and had the quality of a space that had been prepared for her without any fuss being made about the preparation. She put her mother's quilt on the bed. It looked right there, the blues and creams against the plain, ticking mattress. She unpacked her dresses and her working clothes and set her materials on the shelf and put the wooden box with Silas Rowan's letters at the bottom of the trunk under everything else, because it needed to stay, but it did not need to be visible. She looked at the east-facing window for a moment. In the morning, this was the window that would get the first light. She went out to start on the February accounts. The survey came through in the third week of January. Calloway brought the news to the ranch himself, an unusual thing, which told her it was more than the land result, arriving on a gray Tuesday afternoon when Evelyn was at the work table and Gideon was somewhere in the east pasture. Cobb went to get him, and Calloway stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and accepted a cup of coffee and waited with the patience of a man who has delivered both kinds of news enough times to know that waiting for the right person to be present is worth the time it takes. Gideon came in still in his outdoor coat, cold from the pasture, and looked at Calloway and looked at Evelyn and took off his hat. "The survey confirms the eastern acreage as Mercer land," Calloway said. "The original deed was correct. Rowan's claim was not supported." The room was very quiet. "And Rowan?" Gideon asked. "Rowan has been charged with mail fraud," Calloway said. "Two of the women provided formal statements. Yours—" He looked at Evelyn briefly. Yours was the most complete and the most documented. The timeline you prepared was entered into the county record. Evelyn set down her pen. He'll likely lose the neighboring property as part of the settlement, Calloway continued. His wife, he paused. Mrs. Rowan has filed for a legal separation. She apparently had more information about his activities than anyone realized and had been waiting for someone to open a door she could walk through. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. Is that enough? Gideon asked. He was looking at Evelyn when he said it, not at Calloway. She thought about the question, about what enough meant and whether it was the right word for what she felt, which was not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction was too tidy for what had actually happened, but something more like a settling, the way a structure settles after it's been properly built. Not dramatic, just solid. It's the law doing what it can do, she said. That's what I asked it to do. Calloway left 20 minutes later. Gideon walked him out and came back in and stood in the kitchen with his coat still on. The afternoon light was already going, the way it went in January before 5 o'clock, and the kitchen was warm from the stove and smelled like the coffee Cobb had made earlier that was still sitting on the back of the stove getting thick. He'll be charged, Gideon said. Yes. And the land is settled. Yes. He looked at her across the kitchen. How are you? The question surprised her, coming in that particular moment, in that particular tone, simple and direct, genuinely asking. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think I'll know more in a few days. He nodded like that was a sensible answer. He took off his coat and hung it by the door. He went to the stove and poured himself the thick coffee without appearing to notice it was thick, the way a man does when he's been drinking bad coffee for years and has stopped registering it as bad. I want to tell you something, he said, still facing the stove. You can tell me it's not the right time and I'll wait. She said nothing, which was the same as telling him to go ahead. He turned around. He held the coffee cup with both hands, and he looked at her with the same quality of directness he'd used the day he'd told her about standing in the livery after Margaret died. The directness of someone who has thought about what he's going to say and decided that saying it plainly was the only way to say it. I can't write letters, he said. I think we've established that I'm not a man who… A slight pause. What I can do is what I've been doing. The room, the coffee on your table in the mornings, asking you what you think about things because your thinking is better than most thinking I've come across. He stopped. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm telling you what's true because I think you've had enough of people not telling you what's true. The kitchen was very still. She looked at him, at this man who had lifted her trunk without being asked, and paid a week's lodging and left her alone to do her work, and listened when she talked and did not perform more than he felt, and had put a new piece of stovepipe in her room before she moved in without saying a word about it. I know what you've been doing, she said quietly. I know you know, he said. I wanted to say it out loud anyway. She stood up from this table. The last of the daylight was coming through the window above the wash basin, thin and pale, and it fell across the floor between them. Ask me again in the spring, she said, when the ground is clear and the survey's in the records and it's not… She paused, looking for the right words. When it's not tangled up with everything else that just happened. Ask me when it can just be what it is. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. That's not a no, she said. I know it isn't, he said. And something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the quiet of a man who has said what needed saying and can now go back to work, which was what both of them did. She sat back down at the work table. He went out to check on the horses before dark. The stove ticked, the light faded, and the Mercer Ranch went quiet around her in the way it did at the end of a day. A working quiet, the kind that has been earned. Outside, the Montana winter pushed against the walls and found them solid. Spring in Montana does not arrive as an event. It arrives as an argument, the cold making its case, the land pushing back, neither side willing to concede cleanly. February stayed hard. March came in with 2 feet of new snow that took the better part of a week to negotiate and left the road to the ranch impassable for 4 days, during which Evelyn worked at the kitchen table at the Alderman house and organized the correspondence filing system she'd been meaning to restructure since October. April was better. The snow began retreating to the north-facing slopes. The creek running along the east edge of the Mercer property rose with snowmelt, and then gradually settled back into its banks. And the grass that came up afterward was the particular sharp green of ground that's been under snow for months and is making up for lost time. She noticed the morning she knew winter was actually finished. She was standing at her east-facing window with coffee she'd made herself. She'd started making her own in the mornings because Gideon's coffee had not improved despite several indirect opportunities for it to do so, and the light came through the glass in a way it hadn't done all winter. Not the thin, pale light of January or the cold, white light of February, but actual morning light with color in it, gold-edged and low, and moving across the floor in a way that made the room look like a different room than the one she'd been living in. She stood there for a while, longer than she needed to. Then she finished her coffee and went to start on the April accounts. Gideon did not ask her again. He'd said all right and meant it, which was consistent with how he did everything. He didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't push on things he'd agreed to let rest. She registered this without commenting on it, in the same way she'd been registering things about him for months and filing them into the accumulating record of who he actually was. What she noticed, in the waiting that he did without making it visible, was that nothing between them changed in the small ways that would have changed if the waiting had been strategic. If he'd been performing patience in order to get an answer he'd already decided he wanted. The coffee still appeared on the corner of the table without comment. He still asked her opinion on things and listened when she gave it. He was still difficult to read on his worst days and direct past the point of comfort on others, and he still occasionally got things wrong, miscalculated a supply need, or made a decision about the east pasture rotation that she could see from the records was going to create a problem in June and that she pointed out to him, and he listened to her point and pushed back. And they spent 20 minutes at the work table arguing about pasture rotation in the way people argue when they both know enough to disagree usefully, and she turned out to be right, and he acknowledged it without drama 2 weeks later when the numbers confirmed it. It was, she thought, the most honest version of how people could be together that she'd ever seen from close range. Not comfortable in the easy sense, but real. The trial, if it could be called that, which was apparently a technical question Calloway had some uncertainty about, concluded in late March. Silas Rowan was convicted of mail fraud in connection with 3 separate complainants across 2 counties. The penalty was a substantial fine and a period of supervised restriction that effectively barred him from engaging in any property dealings for 7 years. His neighboring ranch was placed in a forced sale process to satisfy the financial judgment. Calloway rode out to tell them personally, the same way he'd come in January with the survey news. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had not improved since January and told them the outcome in plain terms. "It's not prison," he said. "I know that's not—" "It's what the law allows," Evelyn said. "It is." He looked at her. "Your documentation was the backbone of the case, the timeline, the correspondence dates, the pattern you laid out. The county prosecutor told me it was the clearest evidence packet he'd received in 8 years. She nodded once. "The woman from Ohio sent a letter," Calloway added, reaching into his coat, "to the court, for the record. She asked that it be shared with you." He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it but didn't pick it up yet. "How is she?" "Remarried, from what I understand. She has a daughter." He paused. "She wrote that she'd spent 2 years being ashamed of what happened to her, and that knowing there was a legal record, knowing it was acknowledged as a wrong rather than just her bad judgment, mattered to her, her words." Evelyn picked up the letter then. She read it at the table while Calloway finished his coffee. It was 2 pages in careful handwriting, and it said, among other things, exactly what Calloway had described. And at the end it said, "I hope you stayed. You sound like someone who was worth staying." She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. After Calloway left, Gideon stood at the kitchen window for a moment with his back to her, looking out at the yard where Cobb was doing something to the harness rack. She could see the set of his shoulders. Not tense, but still, the way he went still when he was taking something in. "It's done," he said. "Yes." "How do you feel?" She'd been sitting with that question since Calloway had ridden up the road. She'd expected to feel more. She'd expected some version of release, the sharp kind, the dramatic kind that people described when something that had been weighing on them was finally lifted. What she felt instead was quieter, more like the way the creek had settled after the snowmelt. Not empty, not still exactly, but running at its right level. Its natural level. "Like it's been handled," she said. Not like it's been fixed. Some things don't fix. She paused. But handled is enough. Handled means it's in the record, and it's acknowledged, and it doesn't get to just disappear into the past like it was nobody's concern. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the kitchen. Spring, he said. She looked back at him. I know. I told you I'd ask in the spring. I know you did. He came to the table, not fast, not with any performance of significance, and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table in the way he did when he was settling in for a conversation he intended to finish. She'd cataloged that gesture in October, and it hadn't changed. I'm not going to write you letters, he said. I don't think I need to explain why. No, she agreed. What I can tell you is what's true, which is that this house has been a different place since September. Since that first Monday you came out here and told me not to watch while you worked. Something moved in his face. The contained, restrained version of expression that was simply how his feelings operated, compressed and real. I started looking for reasons to come in from the barn. I'd never done that before. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to decide anything about the future right now, he said. I'm asking if you're willing to let it be something, between us, whatever that looks like from here. She looked at him. At this man who had been honest with her when honesty wasn't required, who had paid for a stranger's lodging and then hired her for her skills, and then cleared a room of storage and put in a new stovepipe and argued with her about pasture rotation and listened to every answer she gave as if the answer actually mattered to the outcome. She thought about what she'd believed love looked like before September. She'd believed it looked like letters. She'd believed it looked like declared intentions and romantic architecture, and a man who could describe the light on his land in a way that made it feel like an invitation. She'd been wrong. She'd been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they've been shown a polished surface and mistaken it for the thing underneath. What was underneath was this: a man who showed up. Not in the dramatic sense, not with declarations or gestures that cost him nothing because they were only words. Who showed up in the daily sense, the accumulative sense, who did the small things that added up to something nobody could fake over time because the time itself was the proof. Yes, she said, I'm willing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of what had just been agreed. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't produce a ring or a speech. He just nodded, and she nodded back. And outside the window, the April light was doing what April light does in Montana when winter finally gives up its argument. The April accounts need finishing, she said. I know, he said. He got up and went back out to the barn, and she opened the ledger, and the house settled around them both in its working quiet. They were married in June. It was not a grand wedding. Clara organized most of it because Clara was constitutionally incapable of letting a significant event happen without structure. And Evelyn let her because Clara's organizational instincts were generally sound, and because fighting them would have been more work than the wedding itself. The ceremony was at the edge of the Mercer property, near the creek, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather was doing exactly what you'd want. June weather in Montana to do. Clear sky, long light, a breeze off the mountains that was warm enough to stand in without a coat for the first time since September. Patsy stood beside Evelyn. Cobb stood beside Gideon and looked as though he'd been cleaned up considerably against his will and was managing it with dignity. Clara cried. She did it quietly and without fuss, and denied it afterward when asked. Evelyn wore the better of her two good dresses. The gray one, with the cream collar that she'd originally brought for Sunday church services she'd never ended up attending. She'd let it out slightly at the shoulders over the winter. She'd put on weight, real weight, the kind that comes from regular meals and physical work and a body that is no longer spending its resources on sustained anxiety. And it fit her correctly now in a way it hadn't when she'd packed it in Boston. Gideon wore a dark coat she'd never seen before, which meant he'd acquired it specifically for the occasion, which was a category of effort she found quietly significant. He wasn't good with words during the ceremony, which surprised no one. He held her hands and said what needed to be said and meant it visibly in the way that mattered more than the saying, and she said what she meant in return, and that was that. Afterward, there was food. Clara and two other women from town had been cooking since the previous afternoon, and most of Redstone Crossing came through at some point during the afternoon, which Evelyn had not expected and which told her something about how the town's account of her had changed since September. She was no longer the woman who'd arrived for a man who didn't come. She was something else now, something the town had watched develop over 9 months and apparently decided to claim as its own story. Earl Potts came. He shook her hand with both of his and didn't say much beyond "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," but his face said the rest of it, and she accepted it for what it was. She stood near the creek in the late afternoon, in the long slant of the June light, with a plate she'd barely touched, and the sounds of people around her, and she thought about a woman standing on a platform in September watching a train disappear. That woman had $11.30 and a trunk that was too heavy and a bundle of letters from a man who was already married and a future that had just publicly dissolved. She'd been 30 feet from where Evelyn was standing right now, and the distance between those 2 points was not 9 months, and it was not a marriage, and it was not a county legal proceeding. It was every morning she'd gotten up and done the next necessary thing without knowing yet what the necessary things would add up to. That was the distance. That was the whole of it. 5 years later, on a September morning that arrived with the particular quality of early Montana autumn, cold in the shadows, warm in the sun, the air carrying the clean mineral smell of the mountains beginning their long exhale, Evelyn stood at her east-facing window with coffee she'd made herself and watched the yard below. Their daughter, Clara May, named for obvious reasons, was 4 years old and running between the fence posts with the focused, determined energy of a child who has decided that the space between 2 points needs to be covered repeatedly to be properly understood. She had Gideon's dark hair and Evelyn's stubbornness, which was a combination that kept everyone in the household in a state of alert attention. Their son, Thomas, was 8 months old and currently asleep in the cradle that Gideon had built in February, which was not a perfect cradle. There was a joint on the left rocker that he'd redone twice and still wasn't quite level, but which held a sleeping baby adequately, which was the standard a cradle actually needed to meet. Gideon was in the yard with Clara May, not chasing her, but watching her with the particular expression he had for the children. A quietness inside the quietness, something she didn't have a word for, but that she recognized as the look of a man who is genuinely surprised, at regular intervals, by the fact of his own life. Evelyn had that feeling herself. It came at irregular times, not in the moments you'd expect, not at Christmas or during the summer when the ranch was at its most itself, but in the unremarkable ones. The Tuesday mornings, the after-supper hour when Clara May was in bed and Thomas was fed and the house had gone quiet, and she and Gideon sat at the kitchen table with the accounts or the supply orders, or sometimes nothing in particular, just sitting, in the easy way of people who have run out of things they need to prove to each other. She thought about what she would have said to herself 5 years ago, standing on that platform. She thought about it from time to time, not as an exercise in gratitude. She was suspicious of that kind of self-directed sentiment, which tended to smooth over the harder truths, but because there was something useful in holding both versions in the mind at once, the before and the after. Not to say the after was better, exactly, which was too simple a reading, but to say that the before was necessary, that the specific character of the after came directly from the before, could not have been any other way. Here is what she'd learned and what she still believed. That loneliness makes people vulnerable to beautiful surfaces, that a person in the right kind of pain will accept a well-written letter as evidence of a well-formed soul because the pain needs the letter to be true. She'd been that person. She didn't think poorly of herself for it. It was a human thing to do, and the fault lay with the man who'd understood exactly how it worked and used it deliberately. But she also didn't pretend it hadn't happened, or that she'd been simply unlucky. She'd been unlucky and willing, and the willingness was worth understanding. What she'd learned to look for afterward was not the declaration but the pattern, not what a person said they were, but the accumulation of what they did over time in small moments, when nobody was watching and there was nothing to be gained by performing. The cup of coffee on the corner of the table, the new stovepipe, the all right that meant what it said, a man who listened not to respond but to actually know. Those things didn't announce themselves. They didn't arrive with the compelling rhythm of a letter composed specifically to move you. They required paying attention over time, which required, and this was the part she'd needed September to teach her, staying. She had stayed. Not because she'd seen clearly from the beginning where staying would lead, but because she'd had nowhere to go and $11 and some skills and the determination not to be erased by what had happened to her, and she'd done the next thing, and the next thing after that, and the things had accumulated into a yard where her daughter ran between fence posts in the September light, and her husband watched with that quiet, surprised expression, and the east-facing kitchen was warm with the morning. Below, Clara May stopped running and went to Gideon and said something to him, pointing at something Evelyn couldn't see from the window. He crouched down to her level and looked where she was pointing and said something back. Clara May appeared to find this satisfactory and took off running again. Gideon stood up. He looked toward the house, not up at the window, just toward the house in general, and then he went back to whatever he'd been doing in the yard before the running began. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she set down her coffee, smoothed her hands on her apron, and went downstairs to start on breakfast, because Thomas would wake soon and Clara May would be hungry after her running, and the morning was not going to organize itself. The east window was already full of light by the time she got the stove going. It came through the glass and lay across the kitchen floor in a long, warm stripe, the same light she'd looked for in the window of a house described in letters she'd crossed a continent to reach. She had not found what the letters promised. She had found what they could not have described even if the man who wrote them had been honest, which was that a home is not a place that someone offers you in words. It is a thing you build by showing up every day and doing the work and being the kind of person who can be trusted to still be there when the snow melts and the creek settles and the spring finally arrives to finish the argument. She'd been that person. She was still being her. Outside, Clara May was calling for her father about something, the high, clear voice of a child who has not yet learned to moderate her needs, and Gideon's low answer came back across the yard, and the bread she was making was going to take 40 minutes, and Thomas would wake before it was done. The morning asked her to be present in it, and she was. And it was enough. And it was everything.